Welcome back to Press Coverage. Dan Hope joined by Andy Anders for the second time today, the third time today, if you include Real Pod Wednesdays. We told you earlier this afternoon that if Ohio State made more coaching hires, that we would be back for more episodes of Press Coverage. So fulfilling our promise now, the initial news coming out this afternoon that Ohio State would hire Virginia Tech offensive coordinator Tyler Bowen as its offensive line coach. We already talked about that one, so go find that video if you want to hear what we had to say about Tyler Bowen. But shortly after that, the news coming out that Ohio State had filled out the rest of its offensive coaching staff for the 2025 season, both in the form of internal promotions, as Brian Hartline is being promoted from wide receivers coach to offensive coordinator, while offensive analyst Billy Fessler is being promoted to quarterbacks coach. And so Ohio State, we now know what the offensive coaching staff will look like for the 2025 season. Seeing that staff for the first time, Andy, what are your initial thoughts?
It's an interesting mix. There's a lot of young faces now. The staff got a lot younger when you think about Chip Kelly moving on and now Brian Hartline stepping up to replace that play caller role, that full-time offensive coordinator role. Obviously, Hartline had already been a co-offensive coordinator, but this is the first time in his career now he's going to be handling play calling duties, and that's a massive step up. As far as Billy Fessler goes, another younger guy, but one that I think that hire made a lot of sense. It was one that we talked about quite extensively of like this was a guy you could bring up to be that quarterback's coach. Will Howard shouted him out in his farewell video, and I don't think that's any coincidence. The guy, as an offensive analyst and behind the scenes, did a lot with Ohio State's quarterbacks, and so this is kind of the natural fulfillment of that. And he has previous experience coaching quarterbacks, be it at Akron, be it at UCLA. So that makes a lot of sense. The Hartline hire, it's just, you wonder how much he learned and took from Chip Kelly in this past season as a play caller, because in 2023, Ryan Day gave him that shot in the spring and summer, and he never relinquished play calling duties to Brian Hartline ultimately in the fall. So how much has Hartline grown over the past couple of seasons as a play caller after getting that shot and not really capitalizing on the opportunity? And because obviously it's going to be a crucial role, especially as it seems that Day, as he should, because it bore great results, Day is set on staying in that CEO role and continuing to delegate that play calling responsibility.
Yeah, we talked about it on Sunday when Chip Kelly left for the Raiders that, whether Ohio State went with Brian Hartline on this hire was going to tell us how much Ryan Day thinks Brian Hartline has grown over the last couple of years. So I think the fact that he's making this decision now to go with Brian Hartline, to delegate play calling duties to Brian Hartline, who, again, was the offensive coordinator in 2023, but was not the lead play caller. And so, while he's been the offensive coordinator before in title, now he's going to truly be the offensive coordinator. And I think this was probably, the more you hear about it, something that was always part of the plan. The idea that, Chip Kelly was going to come in. Ryan Day said it on Sunday night that, when he had conversations at the time of hiring Chip Kelly, that he knew it was a possibility Chip might go to the NFL after 1 year. And so it was clear last year that Ryan Day felt like he needed that veteran offensive coordinator if he was going to delegate play calling duties for the first time in a season where Ohio State had such massive expectations. He needed that guy who had been there, done that, who he really strongly trusted in that role if he was going to transition into being a CEO. And I think Chip Kelly was the perfect guy for Ryan Day to be able to do that. Now that he's won a national championship, we've talked about it on a couple of these videos already. When you win a national championship, it gives you a little more leeway, a little more ability to take a risk. So I think that's probably part of the calculation here of now's the time to give Brian Hartline a shot. Because if they didn't give Brian Hartline a shot, then you risk losing Brian Hartline. And while Brian Hartline is unproven as an offensive play caller, and kind of like we talked about with Tyler Bowen before in terms of an offensive line developer, we're not really going to know how good an offensive play caller Brian Hartline is until the actual games begin. But there's two things that we can say for certain about Brian Hartline that are uncontroversial and just pretty much objective facts at this point. He is the best wide receivers coach in college football. He is the best wide receiver recruiter in college football. And so keeping him happy, keeping him at Ohio State as long as possible has always been a top priority for Ryan Day and Ohio State. And I think making this move now helps ensure that will happen.
Yeah, that's the exact point I was going to make next, Dan. This is the move you make for continuity purposes as much as anything else, and keeping Brian Hartline in the fold as long as possible. And who knows, he could end up being a really good play caller, a really good coordinator, all those game plan things. He obviously has a good understanding of passing concepts and how to execute passing offense. I think what will be interesting, too, is the marriage between him and Tyler Bowen being the run game coordinator, where Justin Fry, that role felt like more of just a title last year, and Chip Kelly's run schemes are kind of the driving force of Ohio State's rushing attack. Given Brian Hartline's maybe leaning toward the passing game and his abilities and experience there, I wonder if some of Tyler Bowen's run game schemes, some of his knowledge, his previous offensive coordinating experience at Virginia Tech, how that marriage might have been kind of planned for Ohio State and Ryan Day, that he wanted someone to come in with a little bit of play calling background and coordinating background and more experience on the run game side of things. And so how those two line up is going to be an interesting thing in the back end for Ohio State as they try to put their players in the best position again to succeed in 2025, because there will be a learning curve for Brian. I think even though there was probably a lot of conversations, like you said, Dan, when Chip Kelly came in about, hey, win a national title, I'll go back to the NFL, you can be next up at OC. There's going to be times it's different when you're actually the man with the job. It's true of anything in football. Once you're actually there on a game day, calling the plays, in practice week, being the guy in charge of implementing the scheme, coming up with the scheme, coordinating all of it, it's right there in the title, offensive coordinator. I think it's different. And so there's going to be a learning curve, like a lot of pieces with this Ohio State 2025 football team. And it goes back to what you said and what we've said numerous times in the last few weeks of, you have this runway now where you won a national title. The fan base, the program, all of it's not going to feel so dire if you ultimately go and have some hiccups early in the season, namely against Texas, while all these new faces, all these inexperienced pieces are getting figured out. Now, a great position coach does not always a great coordinator make. We've seen that in the past. Just like great coordinators don't always make great head coaches. But I think Brian Hartline, for all he's done for Ohio State's program, for the fact that he remains, again, the best developer and recruiter of wide receivers in college football, for all those facts, he's earned this shot. He's earned this opportunity. And I trust Ryan Day's judgment ultimately above all else when making these kinds of hires. And if he thinks that Brian is ready for this, then I trust that judgment, and we'll see how it plays out.
Coaching staff hires are never made in a vacuum. So you're never looking at it and going, okay, we're just hiring 10 different guys to do their own thing. You're always hiring a staff that you think will make sense collaboratively together. So without question, the hiring of bringing in Tyler Bowen, a guy who's got some coordinator experience, while you're promoting a guy into that coordinator role who doesn't have as much of that experience, I think that's certainly not coincidental. I think that's certainly intentional. Worth noting, Billy Fessler has offensive coordinator experience too, albeit only 1 year at Akron. But, this is another guy, I think with Billy Fessler, you're going to have a lot of comparisons made to Corey Dennis, because there's kind of a similar trajectory there where they were kind of, the second in line in that quarterback room, and then they got promoted up into this quarterback's coaching role. But I think Billy Fessler comes with a little bit more of a track record than what Corey Dennis brought into that room, because he has been a full-time quarterbacks coach before. He's been an offensive coordinator before. And so, I think Billy Fessler is very qualified for this job. I think you could certainly see the writing on the wall there, especially when he was out there recruiting last week, making offers to quarterbacks. It was pretty obvious they were priming him to be the guy at quarterbacks coach if Chip Kelly left. And so I don't think any of this caught Ryan Day by surprise. I think the speed with which these hires have been made speaks to that. I mean, we look at on the defensive side of the ball where there was an effort to keep Jim Knowles. Ohio State's still in the process of figuring that defensive staff out. So I think how quickly this offensive staff movement took place certainly speaks to the fact that, Ryan Day knew it was possible he could lose Chip Kelly, he could lose Justin Fry, and he was prepared. And, the other thing in all this too is we also know Ryan Day is going to continue to be heavily involved in the offense. Now, he is that CEO now, but, my guess would be hiring a first-time offensive coordinator. Maybe he spends a little bit more time with the offense this year than maybe he was, for the entirety of last season. And that might be a good thing because it certainly sounded like he was more involved in the offensive game planning during the college football playoff after that Michigan game. And not coincidentally, Ohio State's offense was at its best in the college football playoff. And so, Ryan Day does need to be able to trust Brian Hartline to be the play caller because he does need to be able to spend time with all three units of all the position groups, be that true head coach and not an offensive coordinator playing head coach. But Ryan Day is going to continue to have a massive influence on this offense. And to your point about continuity, that's a big part of it too, is Brian Hartline has been at Ohio State. He's been at Ohio State since 2017, which was Ryan Day's first year on staff. He's been the wide receivers coach since 2018. So these guys have worked together now for 8 years. Brian Hartline knows Ryan Day's offense as well as anybody. And so Ryan Day is not asking Brian Hartline to reinvent the offense. He's asking Brian Hartline to keep it running. And Brian Hartline certainly has more than enough experience at this point, as well as the coaching acumen he's clearly shown as a wide receivers coach, that he should be up to the task.
Excellent points, Dan. And continuity, while we talked about it as not being the primary factor in this hire, it is a nice secondary effect if you feel Brian Hartline's the right guy and, you trust Ryan Day's judgment on these things, as we've said. Especially continuity helps when you're breaking in a new quarterback this fall, whoever that could be, whether it's Julian Sayin, Lincoln Keenholz, if Tavian St. Clair manages to get involved in the competition as a freshman, wherever that lands, it is helpful to have a system that they've been working in, that they're familiar with. Brian Hartline also as a first-time coordinator, having been in the system for so long, as you mentioned, it'll still be Ryan Day's offense, just Brian Hartline running it, doing his own little tweaks to it. That continuity is just, it's helpful to have, not the main factor, as was said, but for Billy Fessler too, you talk about a guy, you mentioned his having a more proven track record than Corey Dennis at the time that he was hired. I think that not only is that true, but I think there's more proof in the pudding at Ohio State when you, again, talk about what Will Howard said about him, just the indications you get that he had a bigger role developing quarterbacks behind the scenes than some realized as Ryan Day and Chip Kelly fulfilled their other obligations to Ohio State's coaching staff. And in the end, like with the offense, Ryan Day is going to have a hand in developing Ohio State's quarterbacks too. Like we've seen it time after time. The guy before he became Ohio State's head coach was known as one of the best developers of quarterbacks in the country. What he did with Dwayne Haskins, with C.J. Stroud, with Justin Fields, and now even with Will Howard, the massive strides he took from last year to this one, which Chip Kelly and Billy Fessler do get some credit for. But Ryan Day's got a track record with this thing. And all that being decided, I think there's a lot to like in terms of the continuity aspects of this hire for Ohio State. And you hope that whatever lessons Brian Hartline took from Chip Kelly last year, his knowledge of the Ryan Day offense that he already possesses, that it all shapes up and ends up working out as the season progresses for this Ohio State offense.
One of the biggest benefits for a guy like Billy Fessler and for Ohio State of the rule change that they made in college football last year to allow analysts, to allow more support staffers to be on the field coaching is it does allow you to bring in guys and kind of develop them for those full-time coach roles. And I think, when Billy Fessler came to Ohio State, just like we talked about with Brian Hartline, I think that was always part of a plan for him too, that by following Chip Kelly to Ohio State after briefly joining the staff at UCLA, that, they knew the rules were going to change. He was going to be able to be integrally involved with the quarterbacks, even though he wasn't going to be a full-time coach. And then that would set him up to have the opportunity to become a full-time coach for the Buckeyes in the future. So again, I think, all this, is definitely stuff that was thought about even before this week, when Chip Kelly was hired, kind of creating these potential secession plans. And I think the other thing too with Billy Fessler that can be beneficial is the fact that he's just the quarterback's coach. Like it's last year with Chip Kelly, and obviously everything went excellently with Will Howard, but he's balancing, those different responsibilities. Obviously, Ryan Day has always been very involved with the quarterbacks, but he's balancing his many responsibilities. When you have a quarterback room like this one, when it is a very inexperienced group, to have a guy who can focus fully on just being the guy who develops quarterbacks with plenty of assistance from Ryan Day. Brian Hartline certainly going to have a big hand in that as well as the offensive coordinator. I think that's something that can be beneficial, for Billy Fessler and for Ohio State. And so Ohio State, once again, to recap, has now completed its offensive coaching staff for the 2025 season. Billy Fessler will be the quarterback's coach. Brian Hartline will remain the wide receivers coach, but also now be the offensive coordinator. Tyler Bowen will be the offensive line coach and the run game coordinator. They join Carlos Lachlan, who will return for his second year as running backs coach, and Keenan Bailey, who will continue to serve as the Buckeyes tight ends coach. Still waiting for answers on who will replace Jim Knowles as defensive coordinator, and whether that could be an internal promotion, potentially Matt Guerrieri, or a combination of Matt Guerrieri and Tim Walton, or will it be someone from the outside? Either way, Ohio State going to be bringing in at least one new defensive coach to replace Jim Knowles. And so whenever we get those answers on the defensive side of the ball, we'll be back for yet another episode of press coverage to break those down. But in the meantime, hope you enjoyed this episode, and we'll catch you next time.